Open that trailer, now!
Breaking that federal seal is illegal.
She thinks paperwork can save her.
No, but the FBI can.
A black trucker hauling a sealed trailer. That usually means someone's got something to hide. Open the doors now. Officer Bryce Holloway swerved his patrol SUV across both lanes of Interstate 40, forcing the 18-wheeler to slam on its brakes. Rain pounded the windshield as he jumped out, stormed to the cab, and ripped the driver's door open so hard it crashed against the side of the truck. "Move!" he roared, grabbing Renee Jackson, the black woman behind the wheel, by the arm and dragging her down the slick metal steps. Renee steadied herself without resisting. Bryce shoved her toward the trailer and sneered, "People like you always play innocent until the doors swing open. Then we find out what you're really hiding." She spoke calmly. "Breaking that federal seal is against the law." He burst into mocking laughter, ripped the shipping manifest from her hands, and threw it into a muddy puddle. "The law," he scoffed. "You're a black truck driver standing in my county. Around here, my badge matters a lot more than your rights." A few truckers gasped. Several phones were already recording. Bryce pulled out his handcuffs and stepped closer. "When I'm done with you, that truck will be impounded. You'll be in a cell, and nobody will remember your name." Renee never argued. She only glanced at her waterproof watch and waited. "Before we reveal why Renee stayed so calm, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. If you believe no one should be judged by their appearance, profession, or the color of their skin, leave a comment below. And if stories of courage, justice, and unforgettable reversals inspire you, subscribe and stay with us, because Officer Bryce Holloway has no idea that the next few minutes will destroy everything he thought he controlled. Hey everyone, somewhere ahead, the road bends and I have no idea what's waiting past it. That's exactly why I'm going. Come find out with me." 3 days earlier, before the storm, before the handcuffs, and before Officer Bryce Holloway made the biggest mistake of his career, Renee Jackson's morning had begun, like hundreds of others. At 4:45 a.m., she parked her dark blue Freightliner outside a small truck stop in eastern Tennessee. The pre-dawn air was cool, carrying the familiar scent of diesel fuel and fresh coffee. Truckers from every corner of the country shuffled inside, exchanging sleepy nods before another long haul. Renee preferred the quiet. She carried herself with calm confidence, never demanding attention. At 36, she had spent nearly 12 years driving commercial routes across America. Her driving record was spotless. No accidents, no cargo claims, no customer complaints. Most people remembered her because she always smiled before speaking. The waitress behind the counter looked up. "Morning, Renee. Same breakfast." "You already know me too well," Renee replied with a warm laugh. As she waited for her coffee, an older truck driver walked in, carrying a faded baseball cap beneath his arm. "Morning, Isaiah." Isaiah Turner smiled. "If it isn't the hardest working woman on Interstate 40. Renee chuckled. "I'm just trying to make my delivery on time." Isaiah lowered his voice. "You hear who's working highway patrol this week?" She shook her head. "Bryce Holloway." The smile faded slightly from Isaiah's face. "He stopped 2 black drivers yesterday. Held one of them for almost 2 hours. Never found a thing." Another driver nearby quietly added, "He doesn't need evidence. He just needs someone he thinks won't fight back." The diner fell unusually silent. Everyone knew the name. Officer Bryce Holloway had earned a reputation stretching across 3 counties. Officially, he was praised for aggressive enforcement against cargo theft. Unofficially, truckers traded stories about impossible inspections, humiliating roadside searches, and suspicious delays that always seemed to target the same kinds of drivers, especially black drivers. No one could ever prove discrimination. But everyone noticed the pattern. Isaiah stirred his coffee without looking up. "Shocking if he pulls you over." He hesitated. "Don't give him any reason." Renee answered softly. "I never do." Neither man realized how much weight those words carried. After breakfast, Renee walked outside into the cool morning air. Her trailer had already been inspected the previous evening. Every seal had been documented. A white SUV waited several spaces away. Its windows were deeply tinted. A man stepped out wearing plain clothes. No badge, no introduction. He simply handed Renee a sealed envelope. "For today's route." She nodded. "I understand." The man returned to the SUV without another word. Anyone watching would have assumed it was ordinary shipping paperwork. It wasn't. Inside the envelope were revised delivery instructions, a coded emergency frequency, and one sentence printed in bold. "Maintain cover. Do not reveal your identity under any circumstances unless authorized." Renee folded the paper carefully and slipped it into an inside pocket. Her expression never changed. Minutes later, she climbed into the Freightliner and eased onto Interstate 40. To every passing driver, she looked exactly like what she appeared to be, a hard-working black truck driver delivering commercial freight. Nothing more. Nearly 70 miles away, Officer Bryce Holloway leaned back in his patrol vehicle while sipping coffee. Deputy Logan Pierce approached the open window. "You've got another inspection scheduled," Bryce smirked. "I make my own schedule." Logan laughed. "You still chasing truckers?" "I'm chasing criminals." His radio crackled. A dispatcher mentioned an incoming commercial vehicle matching Renee's trailer number. Bryce glanced at the information displayed on the screen. Single female driver. Commercial route, sealed cargo, long-distance permit. His eyes narrowed. "What have we got here?" Logan shrugged. Probably another routine delivery. Bryce wasn't convinced. "You know what I've learned? The ones acting the calmest usually have the most to hide." He started the engine, especially when they think nobody's paying attention. Logan watched Bryce pull away before quietly making a phone call. "We've got movement," he said. No names were mentioned, no destination, only one sentence. "Be ready." Back on the highway, Renee kept both hands steady on the wheel. Country music played softly through the speakers. She passed farms, rolling hills, and early morning commuters without drawing a second glance. Yet every few minutes her eyes flicked toward the side mirror. A black SUV had appeared nearly 30 miles earlier. It never got too close. It never passed. It simply stayed there, matching her speed. Watching. Renee noticed. She said nothing. Instead, she reached down and adjusted the position of an ordinary-looking travel mug sitting in the cup holder. Hidden beneath its base, a tiny encrypted transmitter flashed once before turning dark again. Hundreds of miles away, inside a secure operations center, several computer monitors immediately changed color. One technician looked toward the front of the room. "Supervisor Hayes?" "T-Day." Victor Hayes walked over without panic. "What is it?" The beacon just checked in. Victor studied the moving location marker on the digital map. "She's entering the surveillance corridor." He folded his arms. "Tell every team to stay invisible." Another agent asked quietly, "What if local law enforcement interferes?" Victor looked at the screen for several silent seconds. "They will." His voice was calm. "And that's exactly what we're waiting for." Far ahead on Interstate 40, a patrol SUV eased onto the highway. Its emergency lights remained off. Officer Bryce Holloway smiled as Renee's Freightliner appeared in the distance. He finally had his target. Bryce Holloway kept nearly half a mile behind Renee's Freightliner. He wasn't following her because of a traffic violation. He was hunting for an excuse. The morning sky had darkened as thick storm clouds gathered over the Tennessee mountains. A steady drizzle coated the highway, but Renee maintained a perfect speed exactly 65 miles per hour. Her turn signals flashed at every lane change. She left safe following distances. Every movement behind the wheel reflected years of discipline. Bryce clicked his tongue in frustration. "Come on," he muttered. "Give me something." Nothing. He switched on the patrol car's dash camera, then keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 27. I'm observing a commercial tractor trailer displaying suspicious driving behavior. I'll be conducting an investigative stop." The dispatcher sounded confused. "Unit 27, can you specify the violation?" Bryce glanced toward the truck. Failure to maintain lane consistency. In reality, Renee's truck had never crossed a single lane marker. The dispatcher hesitated before answering. "Copy." Bryce smiled to himself. By the time anyone reviewed the footage, the story would already belong to him. Several miles ahead, Renee noticed the patrol SUV closing in through her side mirror. Her expression remained unchanged. She pressed a small button on the steering wheel. The cab's interior camera silently activated. Every second inside the truck was now being securely recorded. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the rearview mirror. The black SUV that had shadowed her all morning was still there, far enough away to avoid suspicion, close enough to intervene if necessary. She knew the plan. She also knew the hardest part of undercover work wasn't gathering evidence. It was enduring injustice without exposing yourself too soon. Suddenly, red and blue lights exploded behind her. The piercing siren echoed across the interstate. Nearby drivers instinctively changed lanes. Renee calmly activated her right turn signal and guided the Freightliner onto the wide shoulder. She placed both hands on the steering wheel before Bryce had even stepped out of his cruiser. Inside his patrol vehicle, Bryce adjusted his body camera. Then, with a smirk, he turned the microphone slightly away from his mouth. Just enough to distort certain words. Not enough for anyone to notice. He climbed out into the drizzle. By then, several truckers had slowed their speed. Commercial drivers always watched when another truck was stopped. Most understood exactly why. Bryce climbed onto the running board and pounded aggressively against the driver's window. Renee lowered it. "License, registration, logbook." She handed each document over without a word. Bryce flipped through them for only a few seconds before tossing them carelessly onto her passenger seat. You nervous?" "No, officer. You should be." He leaned closer. "I've stopped enough drivers to know when someone's hiding something. My paperwork is complete. We'll decide that." He walked slowly around the truck, pretending to inspect the tires. Nothing. The brakes looked perfect. The lights functioned properly. The DOT inspection stickers were current. Everything frustrated him. Deputy Logan Pierce arrived moments later in another patrol vehicle. He stepped out with a grin. "What have you got?" Bryce answered loudly enough for Renee to hear. "Probably another courier who thinks federal paperwork makes her untouchable." Logan laughed. "I've seen that before." Bryce looked back toward the cab. "Let's see what's inside." He climbed back to Renee's window. "I need you to step out." "May I ask why?" "Because I said so. I've complied with every lawful request." Bryce's smile disappeared. "You know what your problem is." Renee remained silent. "You think being polite makes you innocent?" Without warning, he opened the driver's door himself. Several passing motorists honked as they watched the confrontation unfold. Renee carefully climbed down. As soon as both feet reached the pavement, Bryce took one deliberate step closer. "So," he said, folding his arms, "who packed your trailer?" "The shipping company listed on the manifest." "You expect me to believe you never looked inside?" "The cargo was sealed before I accepted the load." Bryce circled her like a prosecutor questioning a suspect. "A sealed trailer, a nervous driver, and perfect paperwork." He smirked. "That's almost too perfect." Isaiah Turner happened to be driving the opposite direction. The flashing patrol lights immediately caught his attention. He pulled into a nearby emergency turnout and looked through binoculars he kept in his cab. His face tightened. "No." Without hesitation, he grabbed his phone. Meanwhile, another vehicle slowed near the shoulder. Olivia Bennett, an investigative reporter returning from a courthouse assignment, noticed the unusual stop. Something about Bryce's aggressive posture stood out immediately. She reached into the passenger seat for her professional camera. "Please don't let this become what I think it is," she whispered. The lens zoomed in. Every movement became crystal clear. Back at the roadside, Bryce walked toward the rear of the trailer, his eyes fixed on the bright yellow federal security seal. He looked back at Renee. "Unlock it," she answered calmly. "I can't." His eyebrows lifted. "Can't or won't. I don't have legal authority to break a federally documented seal." Bryce laughed loudly. "You hear that?" he called to Logan. "She's teaching me the law." Logan chuckled. "I guess truck driving comes with a law degree now." A few passing drivers shook their heads. Others quietly continued recording. Bryce stepped within inches of Renee's face. His voice dropped into a dangerous whisper. "I've been wearing this badge for 16 years. Nobody tells me what I can or can't open." He reached toward the locking bar. Renee's heartbeat remained steady. She knew exactly what would happen if he broke that seal. The operation would move into its next phase, but only if he made that choice himself. She gave him one final warning. "Officer Holloway, if you break that seal without authorization, there will be consequences you cannot undo." Bryce stared at her for a long second. Then a slow, arrogant smile spread across his face. "Watch me." His hand closed tightly around the heavy bolt cutter resting in the back of his patrol SUV. The rain intensified, drumming against the aluminum trailer, as if warning everyone to stop. Officer Bryce Holloway ignored it. With a smug grin, he lifted the heavy bolt cutters from his patrol SUV and held them high enough for every passing driver to see. "You had your chance," he said coldly. "Now I'm done asking." Renee Jackson stood motionless, rain streaming down her face. "I've warned you twice," she said quietly. "Breaking that seal without federal authorization is illegal." Bryce rolled his eyes. "There you go again." He looked toward Deputy Logan Pierce. "Did you hear that?" Logan laughed. "She still thinks she gets to tell us how to do our jobs." Bryce turned back toward Renee. "You know what I think." He leaned so close she could smell the coffee on his breath. "I think you're bluffing." Then, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, he shouted, "She's just another black trucker trying to scare a cop with paperwork." A ripple of uncomfortable silence spread among the gathering crowd. Several truck drivers exchanged uneasy glances. One younger driver quietly muttered, "This doesn't feel right." Another kept recording without lowering his phone. Bryce raised the bolt cutters. With one violent squeeze, snap, the federal security seal broke apart and clattered onto the wet pavement. For a split second, everything became strangely quiet. Even Renee closed her eyes for the briefest moment. Not in fear, in acceptance. The line had just been crossed. Bryce grabbed the trailer handle and swung both cargo doors open. The crowd leaned forward. Logan stepped beside him, wearing a confident grin. "So," he said, "what have we got? Nothing." The enormous trailer was almost completely empty. Only a single wooden shipping crate sat secured in the center by heavy straps. Bryce frowned. "What the hell?" He climbed inside. No hidden compartments, no drugs, no weapons, no stolen electronics. Nothing. He kicked the crate. "Open this." Renee remained outside. "I don't have the key." Bryce looked back angrily. "Convenient." He signaled Logan. "Pry it open." Logan fetched a crowbar from the patrol SUV. Within seconds, they forced the crate apart. Inside. Foam padding, protective brackets, empty space. Bryce's expression darkened. "She dumped the cargo." Logan nodded quickly. "Had to." Bryce pointed directly at Renee. "I knew it." He jumped down from the trailer and marched toward her. "Where is it?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me." "I'm answering truthfully." Bryce suddenly grabbed her backpack from the passenger side of the truck. "Let's see what else you're hiding." Without asking permission, he unzipped it and dumped everything into the muddy shoulder. Clothes, a flashlight, a Bible with worn edges, a family photograph, a notebook, a lunch container wrapped in a towel. The rain soaked everything within seconds. The photograph landed face up. It showed Renee standing beside two elderly people, all smiling beneath a 4th of July fireworks display. Bryce glanced at it before carelessly stepping on the picture with his boot. "You should have packed better." The heel of his boot smeared mud across the faces. Isaiah Turner watched from across the highway, gripping his steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "Enough," he whispered. He immediately dialed a number stored under only one name, Victor. The call connected. "Hutch, I think your driver just got stopped." Inside the FBI Operations Center, Supervisory Special Agent Victor Hayes looked up instantly. "Who?" "Renee." Victor stood so abruptly his chair rolled backward. "Location." Isaiah gave him the nearest mile marker. Victor's face hardened. "Has Holloway made contact?" "He already broke the federal seal." Every conversation inside the operations room stopped. Victor slowly removed his glasses. "Repeat that." "He broke the seal himself." Victor looked toward Ethan Brooks. "Confirm the live feed." Ethan's fingers flew across his keyboard. Seconds later, satellite positioning, encrypted cab footage, and remote surveillance feeds all appeared on the massive display wall. "Confirmed." Victor nodded once. Phase 2 begins. Back on Interstate 40, Olivia Bennett continued filming. Her camera captured Bryce scattering Renee's belongings across the flooded shoulder. She lowered the lens for a moment, stunned. "This isn't an inspection anymore," she whispered into her recorder. "It's public humiliation." She lifted the camera again just as Bryce grabbed Renee's notebook. He flipped through pages filled with mileage logs and handwritten reminders. "Call Mom." "Replace windshield wiper," he laughed. "I was expecting secret codes." He ripped several pages out before throwing the notebook into a puddle. Renee inhaled slowly. For the first time, pain flickered across her face. Not because of herself, because that notebook contained memories from years on the road with her late father, who had taught her to drive a truck before he passed away. Bryce mistook her silence for weakness. "There it is," he mocked. "I finally found something you care about." Without warning, he grabbed one of her wrists. The steel handcuff clicked shut. You are now being detained pending investigation for obstruction and suspected destruction of evidence, Olivia gasped. On what evidence? Bryce ignored her. Logan stepped between Olivia and the scene. Back up, ma'am. I have every right to record. You'll record from farther away. Meanwhile, several truckers had quietly parked along the shoulder. None of them shouted, none interfered. But nearly every phone camera remained pointed toward Bryce. He noticed. He simply didn't care. He looked at Renee with complete confidence. You should have opened that trailer when I asked. Renee met his eyes for the first time since the stop began. Her voice remained calm. You've made several decisions today. Bryce smirked. And you'll have to live with every one of them. He laughed so loudly that even Logan joined in. Neither man noticed the faint vibration coming from Bryce's own police radio. A secure federal frequency had just overridden local communications. Dozens of encrypted messages began moving across agencies throughout 3 states. Less than 20 miles away, black SUVs accelerated onto Interstate 40. And high above the storm clouds, the distant thump of helicopter blades slowly grew louder. Bryce heard the sound. He glanced toward the dark sky. Then he shrugged. They're not coming for you, he said with a grin. Renee said nothing. But deep inside, she knew the countdown had already begun. The cold steel of the handcuff dug into Renee Jackson's wrist as Officer Bryce Holloway led her toward the patrol SUV. Rainwater streamed down her jacket, soaking the FBI-issued transmitter concealed beneath the inner lining. It had been designed to survive storms far worse than this one. Bryce opened the rear passenger door. Get in. Renee looked at him calmly. Am I under arrest? No. Then what am I being detained for? Bryce leaned against the doorframe with a smug smile. For whatever I decide after we get to the station. Olivia Bennett lowered her camera for only a second. Officer, she called out. Under Tennessee law, you're required to state the legal basis for a detention. Bryce didn't even turn around. I don't answer questions from reporters. You'll answer them eventually. He shot her a cold glare. Not today. He shoved Renee into the back seat before slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Inside the cruiser, Renee quietly adjusted her posture. Her breathing remained steady. She watched raindrops slide across the glass, while the hidden transmitter beneath her jacket emitted another silent, encrypted signal. Miles away, Ethan Brooks looked up from his monitor. Signal strength hasn't changed. Victor Hayes nodded. She's still maintaining cover. A younger agent frowned. How is she staying so calm? Victor didn't look away from the digital map, because she knows panic ruins investigations. Another monitor suddenly displayed live GPS movement. Bryce's patrol vehicle had begun heading toward the county sheriff's office. Victor folded his arms. Good. One agent looked surprised. Good. The farther Holloway goes, the more evidence he creates. Back on the highway, Deputy Logan Pierce climbed into his own cruiser and followed closely behind. Over the police radio, Bryce laughed. Looks like our truck driver finally ran out of stories. Logan chuckled. Think she'll start talking at the station? Oh, everybody talks eventually. Neither man realized every word transmitted through their radios was now being intercepted by a federal monitoring unit. Inside the operations center, technicians quietly recorded each exchange. No edits, Victor instructed. I want every second preserved. Meanwhile, Olivia Bennett climbed into her news vehicle. She wasn't letting the story end on the roadside. As she drove, she called her editor. She said, I've just witnessed what appears to be an unlawful commercial vehicle inspection. Her editor immediately asked, Did you get video? I got everything. Then stay with them. I'm already on my way. Across town, Isaiah Turner had also started his engine. His old Freightliner wasn't fast, but experience had taught him something important. Sometimes justice arrived because ordinary people refused to drive away. He stayed several vehicles behind the patrol cars. At the sheriff's office, Chief Melissa Grant stepped out of the building after hearing approaching sirens. She frowned. Bryce wasn't scheduled to bring anyone in. The patrol SUV rolled into the parking lot. Bryce climbed out wearing the satisfied smile of someone expecting praise. Chief. Melissa looked toward the back seat. Who is she? Possible cargo diversion. What evidence do you have? Bryce hesitated for the briefest moment. Suspicious circumstances. Melissa's eyes narrowed. Meaning, empty trailer. That's not a crime. Broken seal. Who authorized opening it? Bryce answered a little too quickly. I made the call. Melissa stared at him. You broke a federally documented seal yourself. Bryce shrugged. I had probable cause. What probable cause? He paused. Instinct. Melissa didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked through the rain-speckled window at Renee sitting quietly inside the cruiser. The woman didn't appear frightened. She didn't appear angry. She simply waited. That struck Melissa as unusual. Most innocent people became emotional after being publicly humiliated. Most guilty people became defensive. This woman had done neither. Melissa opened the rear door. Ma'am, would you step out, please? Renee complied without hesitation. The handcuff remained attached to one wrist. Melissa noticed immediately. Bryce. Yeah. Remove it. Bryce looked surprised. Chief. Now. Reluctantly, he unlocked the cuff. A deep red mark circled Renee's wrist. Melissa glanced at it. Did she resist? No. Did she attempt to flee? No. Did she threaten anyone? No. Melissa looked directly at Bryce. Then why was she handcuffed? Bryce searched for an answer. It was officer safety. Melissa wasn't convinced. She turned toward Renee. I'm Chief Melissa Grant. Renee nodded politely. Renee Jackson. Would you like to explain what happened? Before Renee could answer, Bryce interrupted. Chief, don't let her manipulate you. Melissa held up one hand. I asked her. Renee spoke softly. I complied with every instruction. You refused to open the trailer. I informed Officer Holloway that the federal seal required authorization. Melissa looked toward Bryce again. So you were warned. Bryce folded his arms. She quoted regulations. And I wasn't taking legal advice from a truck driver. The parking lot fell silent. Even Logan Pierce suddenly found the ground more interesting than the conversation. Melissa's expression hardened. You realize commercial cargo regulations exist for a reason. Bryce scoffed. I caught criminals long before people started hiding behind paperwork. At that moment, Ethan Brooks's voice echoed through the FBI Operations Center. Victor. What is it? The body camera. Victor looked up. What about it? It went offline for exactly 3 minutes. Victor's jaw tightened. Can you recover it? Ethan smiled slightly. He thought he disabled the upload. But the patrol vehicle has a secondary storage module. Victor nodded once. Start downloading everything. Back at the sheriff's office, Olivia Bennett quietly parked across the street. She lifted her long camera lens. Through the glass entrance, she watched Melissa Grant questioning Bryce. Something had changed. The chief no longer looked confident. She looked concerned. Across the parking lot, Bryce's radio suddenly crackled. A dispatcher spoke with unusual urgency. Unit 27. Bryce picked it up. Go ahead. We've just received notification that representatives from a federal agency are requesting access to today's traffic stop. Bryce frowned. What agency? There was a brief pause. Then the dispatcher answered. They didn't say. Bryce exchanged a puzzled glance with Logan. Melissa slowly turned toward him. For the first time that day, Officer Bryce Holloway looked genuinely uncertain. Officer Bryce Holloway lowered his radio slowly. A federal agency, he repeated with a dismissive chuckle. Probably the Department of Transportation. Deputy Logan Pierce forced a laugh. Maybe they're upset about the paperwork. Bryce shrugged. They can file a complaint. But neither man sounded as confident as they had only moments earlier. Chief Melissa Grant noticed it immediately. She had worked with Bryce for nearly 9 years. She knew the difference between confidence and performance. This was performance. Inside the interview room, Renee Jackson sat quietly with a paper cup of coffee resting untouched on the metal table. She had declined an attorney. She had declined making a statement. She had requested nothing. Melissa entered alone. She closed the door behind her. I've reviewed Officer Holloway's initial report. Renee simply looked at her. Melissa continued. He claims you appeared unusually calm during the stop. Renee answered without hesitation. I've learned that staying calm usually prevents situations from getting worse. Melissa nodded slowly. That's not what I meant. She leaned forward. Most people become angry after being treated the way you were. Renee lowered her eyes for a moment. My father always told me something. Melissa waited. When someone wants you to lose control, your greatest victory is refusing to give it to them. The room fell silent. Melissa couldn't explain why those words lingered with her. There was something unusual about this woman. No fear, no bitterness, only discipline. Outside the interview room, Bryce paced the hallway. Logan approached him quietly. You think she's hiding something? Bryce answered immediately. I know she is. What if the trailer really was empty? Bryce stopped walking. It wasn't. But we opened it. Bryce looked toward the closed interview room door. Someone got there first. Logan frowned. Or. Bryce cut him off. Don't. What? Don't start doubting me. Logan raised both hands. I'm just saying, I've built my career reading people. Bryce's jaw tightened. And that woman is lying. Across town, Olivia Bennett parked outside a trucking cooperative where dozens of long-haul drivers gathered between routes. She recognized several faces from previous interviews. One man stepped forward before she even asked a question. You were filming this morning. I was. You saw Bryce. I did. The man sighed heavily. Then you finally saw what we've been living with. Another driver joined the conversation. My cousin lost his contract after Bryce held him for 6 hours. A third trucker spoke up. He searched my trailer 3 different times in 1 month. Did he ever find anything? Olivia asked. The driver laughed bitterly. No. Did anyone file complaints? Everyone looked at one another. Finally, Isaiah Turner stepped out from the crowd. We all did. Olivia turned toward him. What happened? Isaiah answered quietly. They disappeared. What do you mean, our complaints? They were never investigated. Olivia's expression hardened. Do you have copies? Isaiah smiled faintly. I've been driving trucks for 40 years. He reached inside a weathered leather folder. I keep copies of everything. One by one, faded complaint forms landed on the picnic table. Dates, case numbers, badge numbers, every one of them included Officer Bryce Holloway's name. Olivia quickly counted. 8. Isaiah shook his head. Keep going. There were 15 formal complaints spanning almost 6 years. Everyone closed without disciplinary action. Olivia looked stunned. This isn't a pattern, Isaiah answered softly. It's protection. Meanwhile, inside the FBI Operations Center, Ethan Brooks finally leaned back from his computer. I've got it. Victor Hayes walked over. The body camera. Ethan nodded. He manually interrupted the live upload. But he forgot something. Victor folded his arms. The backup cache. Ethan smiled. Exactly. He pressed enter. Video began playing. The room remained silent. Bryce's voice echoed through the speakers. A black trucker hauling a sealed trailer that usually means someone's got something to hide. Victor didn't react. He simply watched. The footage continued. Every insult, every threat, every shove. Then came the moment Bryce intentionally threw Renee's shipping documents into the mud. An FBI attorney standing nearby quietly spoke. That's evidence tampering. The video continued. You're a black truck driver standing in my county. Around here, my badge matters a lot more than your rights. Several agents exchanged looks. Victor still said nothing. Then the recording reached the most important moment. Renee's calm warning. Breaking that federal seal without authorization is illegal. Bryce laughed. Watch me. The bolt cutters snapped shut. The seal broke. Victor paused the video. He looked around the room. Everyone heard that. Every agent nodded. He knowingly violated federal procedure after receiving a direct warning. Sarah Collins, the federal prosecutor assigned to the operation, quietly closed her notebook. That statement alone changes everything. Victor nodded. No defense attorney can argue mistake anymore. Ethan switched to another screen. I've also recovered GPS history. A digital map appeared. Several red markers lined Interstate 40. What am I looking at? Sarah asked. Ethan enlarged the display. Every commercial stop Bryce Holloway conducted during the last 18 months. Victor noticed something immediately. They're clustered. Ethan nodded. Within 10 miles of 3 specific warehouse districts. Sarah slowly stood. Those are Vincent Crow's distribution routes. The room suddenly became very quiet. Victor looked toward another analyst. Cross-reference Deputy Logan Pierce. The analyst typed rapidly. Less than 30 seconds later, another map appeared. Blue markers almost perfectly overlapped the red ones. Victor exhaled slowly. So they weren't working independently. Sarah finished his thought. They were selecting trucks. At the sheriff's office, Bryce had no idea his entire history was being reconstructed in real time. He sat behind his desk, pretending to finish paperwork. His phone buzzed. A text message appeared from an unknown number. Stop talking. Lawyers only. Bryce frowned. Another message arrived seconds later. Federal agents are asking questions. His heartbeat quickened. He immediately deleted both messages, unfortunately for him. The surveillance camera mounted above his desk recorded every movement. Across the hall, Chief Melissa Grant received a phone call from dispatch. Her expression changed before she even spoke. I understand. She hung up slowly. Bryce looked up. What now? Melissa held his gaze for several long seconds. The federal representatives. She paused. They're 5 minutes away. Bryce forced a smile. Good. But as thunder rolled over the building once more, Even he no longer believed his own confidence. For the first time in years, Officer Bryce Holloway wondered whether the badge on his chest would be enough to save him. A heavy silence settled over the sheriff's office. Officer Bryce Holloway looked toward the front entrance every few seconds, but no black SUVs had appeared yet. The federal representatives dispatch mentioned were still minutes away. He intended to use every one of those minutes. Bryce pushed open the interview room door. Chief Melissa Grant looked up. "I didn't authorize another interview." Bryce forced a polite smile. "I just need 5 minutes." Melissa studied him carefully. 5. No more. As the door closed behind him, Bryce pulled out a chair and sat directly across from Renee Jackson. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Rain tapped steadily against the narrow window. Finally, Bryce leaned forward. "This is your last chance." Renee met his eyes. "I've answered every lawful question." "You've answered nothing." "I've answered truthfully." Bryce smiled, but there was no humor in it. "You know what happens next." He slid a blank statement form across the table. "You admit you knowingly transported undocumented cargo." Renee looked at the paper without touching it. "I won't sign something that isn't true." Bryce tapped the form with one finger. "Then sign this instead." He pushed another document forward. It falsely stated that Renee had voluntarily consented to the trailer search before the federal seal was broken. She immediately recognized the lie. "I never gave consent." Bryce's expression darkened. "I'm giving you an opportunity to help yourself." "No." "You should think carefully." "I already have." Bryce folded his arms. "If this report says you obstructed an investigation, every trucking company in America will see it." Renee remained silent. "You'll lose your CDL." Silence. "You'll lose your livelihood." Still nothing. Bryce slammed both palms onto the table. "Look at me." Hafdu. Renee slowly raised her eyes. Her calmness infuriated him even more. "You really think someone is coming to rescue you?" She answered quietly. "I've never expected to be rescued." Bryce laughed. "Good. Because nobody's coming." Outside the room, Chief Melissa Grant stood beside the one-way observation window. She couldn't hear every word, but Bryce's body language disturbed her. He wasn't interviewing. He was intimidating. Deputy Logan Pierce approached carefully. "You think he's pushing too hard?" Melissa didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked, "Did she request a lawyer?" "No." "Did she ask to leave?" "No." "Has she raised her voice once?" Logan shook his head. Melissa sighed. "Then why does Bryce look like he's arguing with someone who's already defeated him?" Logan had no answer. Inside the room, Bryce stood and slowly circled Renee. "You know what I think?" He stopped behind her chair. "I think you're protecting someone bigger." She remained silent. "A drug cartel, nothing. Cargo thieves, nothing. Human trafficking, still nothing." Bryce walked back into her line of sight. "Or maybe," he smiled coldly, "maybe you're just smarter than you look." For the first time, Renee spoke before he asked another question. "You've already decided I'm guilty." Bryce shrugged. "Because you are." "No." "Then prove you're innocent." "I don't have to." That answer made Bryce lose what little patience he had left. He snatched the unsigned statement off the table and crumpled it. "You know what?" He pointed toward the holding cells down the hallway. "You can sit in one of those until you decide to cooperate. You don't have probable cause. I'll find some." Outside, Olivia Bennett quietly entered the public lobby carrying her press credentials. The receptionist looked nervous. "I'm sorry, ma'am. The investigation is still active." "I'm not here to interfere." Olivia held up her camera. "I'm here because I witnessed what happened." Before the receptionist could respond, Chief Melissa Grant stepped into the lobby. "You're the reporter from the highway." "I am." Melissa looked at the camera. "Did you record the entire stop from the moment Officer Holloway opened the truck door?" Melissa's expression tightened. "The entire stop. Every minute." Bryce, walking out of the interview room, overheard those words. His heart skipped. "You filmed everything?" Olivia looked directly at him. "Yes." Bryce forced a laugh. "Then you'll see I followed procedure." Olivia didn't respond. Instead, she reached into her camera bag and removed a memory card. "I've already made 3 backup copies." Bryce's smile faded. Meanwhile, inside the FBI Operations Center, Victor Hayes received another update. A tactical supervisor pointed toward a large monitor. "Our surveillance team is in position." Another screen displayed live helicopter footage. 3 black SUVs exited the interstate. 2 unmarked sedans approached from the east. A mobile communications van parked several blocks away. Victor checked his watch. "Status, all teams ready." Sarah Collins closed a thick case file. "The arrest warrants?" Victor nodded. "Signed." "What about the search warrants?" "Also signed." Ethan Brooks looked up from another workstation. "We've traced the deleted text messages from Holloway's phone." Victor raised an eyebrow. To who? Ethan enlarged the screen. A familiar name appeared. Vincent Crow. Sarah looked at Victor. "That's enough." Victor nodded. "It is." Back inside the sheriff's office, Bryce tried one last gamble. He walked back into the interview room carrying a set of vehicle impound forms. He tossed them onto the table. "I'm impounding your truck." Renee calmly read the first page. "There isn't a legal basis listed. I'll complete it later." "You can't." Bryce leaned closer. "I already have." She slowly pushed the papers back toward him. "If you falsify those documents, you'll be committing another crime." Bryce laughed bitterly. "You keep talking like someone with authority." Renee looked directly into his eyes. "No." She spoke so softly, Bryce almost missed it. "I talk like someone who understands consequences." Before Bryce could answer, a deafening roar echoed outside the building. Not thunder, engines. Multiple powerful engines. Every person inside the station instinctively turned toward the front windows. One deputy whispered, "What is that?" Then another voice came from outside. "Vehicles approaching fast." Bryce stepped into the lobby. Through the rain-covered glass, he saw a convoy of black SUVs turning into the parking lot at high speed. Behind them came 2 more vehicles bearing discreet federal government plates. The lead SUV stopped directly in front of the entrance. Its doors opened almost simultaneously. Men and women in dark jackets stepped out with calm precision. Across the back of every jacket in bold gold letters was a single word. FBI. The entire sheriff's office froze. And Officer Bryce Holloway suddenly realized. They weren't there to assist his investigation. They were there because of it. The entire sheriff's office seemed to stop breathing. Rain continued pounding the parking lot as the convoy of black SUVs rolled to a perfect halt outside the entrance. Their headlights reflected across the wet pavement like searchlights. Every deputy instinctively reached for a sidearm. Chief Melissa Grant immediately raised her voice. "Nobody draws a weapon unless there's an immediate threat." The front doors swung open. A tall man in a dark suit stepped inside, followed by 6 agents wearing black windbreakers with gold FBI lettering across their backs. The room fell silent. Supervisory Special Agent Victor Hayes scanned the lobby once before speaking. "Who's in charge?" Melissa stepped forward. "I am. Chief Melissa Grant." Victor nodded respectfully and presented his credentials. Supervisory Special Agent Victor Hayes, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Melissa briefly examined the badge before handing it back. "What can we do for you?" Victor's expression remained calm. "We're here regarding today's traffic stop involving a commercial truck operated by Ms. Renee Jackson." Before Melissa could answer, Bryce Holloway stepped confidently between them. "Good timing." He pointed toward the interview room. "We've detained a suspect transporting suspicious cargo." She refused to cooperate. Victor slowly turned toward Bryce. "And you are Officer Bryce Holloway." Victor's eyes rested on Bryce's badge for several seconds. "So you're Officer Holloway." Bryce smiled proudly. "That's right. We've been expecting to meet you." Bryce mistook the sentence for admiration. "Then you've probably already heard I intercepted the truck before it disappeared." Victor didn't reply. Instead, he calmly asked, "Where is Ms. Jackson?" Bryce gestured toward the interview room. "In custody." Victor's voice immediately hardened. "I'd release her." Bryce frowned. "I'm sorry, release her." Bryce folded his arms. "With respect, Agent, this is a local investigation." Victor's expression never changed. "No. It stopped being local the moment you broke a federally protected evidence seal." The room instantly became quiet. Every deputy looked toward Bryce. He forced a laugh. "I had probable cause." Victor looked at Ethan Brooks, who had entered carrying a rugged evidence case. Ethan opened a tablet. "We have body camera footage confirms Ms. Jackson warned Officer Holloway that the seal required federal authorization." Bryce interrupted. "My body camera was manually interrupted." Ethan finished the sentence for him, but not before the backup system captured everything. Bryce's smile disappeared. Victor took one slow step forward. "Officer Holloway, you were warned. You ignored the warning. You broke the seal anyway. You detained the driver afterward." Every sentence landed like a hammer. Bryce glanced toward Logan Pierce. Logan avoided eye contact. Melissa slowly turned toward Bryce. "Is that true?" Bryce hesitated. Victor spoke again. "We're not finished." He nodded toward another agent. Within seconds, a large monitor was connected to the sheriff's office conference television. Video began playing. The room watched in complete silence. Bryce's own voice echoed through the speakers. "He's just a black trucker hauling a sealed trailer. That usually means someone's got something to hide." Several deputies exchanged uncomfortable looks. Then came another clip. "You're a black truck driver standing in my county. Around here, my badge matters a lot more than your rights." Melissa's face slowly hardened. Another recording followed. "Watch me." The bolt cutters snapped. The federal seal broke. No one spoke. Bryce shifted uneasily. "I can explain." Victor ignored him. "Continue playback." The next recording showed Bryce throwing Renee's paperwork into the mud, then dumping her backpack onto the highway, then stepping on the family photograph. Olivia Bennett stood quietly near the back of the room. Even though she had witnessed everything herself, seeing it again from Bryce's own camera made the abuse look even worse. Melissa closed her eyes briefly. "My God." Bryce looked around desperately. "It wasn't like that." Victor calmly replied, "It was exactly like that." Bryce pointed toward Renee's interview room. She's still hiding something. Victor finally looked directly into Bryce's eyes. You're right. For one brief second, hope returned to Bryce's face. I knew it. Victor nodded once. She has been hiding something. He reached toward the interview room door. Bring Ms. Jackson out. An FBI agent opened the door. Renee stepped into the lobby exactly as she had entered earlier. Her clothes were still damp. Mud still stained the knees of her jeans. The red mark from the handcuff remained visible around her wrist. She quietly walked toward Victor. Bryce folded his arms. See, ask her who she really works for. Victor gave a faint smile. I intend to. He stopped directly in front of Renee. For the first time since arriving, his formal expression softened. Ma'am. The room became perfectly silent. Your undercover assignment is officially terminated. Bryce frowned. What? Victor reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He removed a leather credential wallet. Then, instead of handing it to Renee, he simply stepped aside. Renee calmly reached into the inner pocket of her rain-soaked jacket. Every eye in the building followed the movement. Bryce watched with growing confusion. Slowly, she unfolded a waterproof black credential case. She opened it. A gold badge caught the overhead lights. Beside it sat a federal identification card. Across the top, in unmistakable letters, were the words, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Below the seal appeared her photograph. Special Agent Renee Jackson Bryce stared at it. His mouth opened. No sound came out. Victor broke the silence. For the past 18 months, Special Agent Renee Jackson has been operating undercover as part of a joint FBI public corruption task force investigating organized cargo theft and law enforcement corruption along the Interstate 40 freight corridor. The room froze. Deputy Logan Pierce's face turned completely white. Chief Melissa Grant slowly stepped backward, unable to take her eyes off Renee. Olivia lowered her camera in disbelief. Isaiah Turner, standing just outside the doorway, smiled for the first time all day. Bryce looked at Renee as though he had never seen her before. You, his voice cracked. You're FBI. Renee met his eyes calmly. No, Officer Holloway. She gently closed the credential wallet. I've always been FBI. And at that exact moment, every arrogant word Bryce had spoken on the highway came crashing back to destroy him. No one moved. No one spoke. The words, I've always been FBI, echoed through the sheriff's office long after Renee Jackson closed her credential wallet. Officer Bryce Holloway stood frozen. His face had lost every trace of arrogance. This, he stammered, this is a setup. Supervisory Special Agent Victor Hayes calmly turned toward two FBI agents. Secure the room! Without a word, the agents moved into position, quietly blocking every exit. Deputy Logan Pierce instinctively took a step backward. Victor noticed. Deputy Pierce! Logan stopped immediately. Please remain where you are. His voice was polite, but it wasn't a request. Chief Melissa Grant slowly removed her reading glasses. She looked from Bryce to Renee, then back to Victor. I need someone to tell me exactly what's happening. Victor nodded. You deserve the truth. He signaled Ethan Brooks. The young forensic analyst connected another encrypted drive to the conference room television. This investigation began 18 months ago, Victor said, following a nationwide pattern of high-value cargo disappearing after traffic stops along Interstate 40. A digital map filled the screen. Dozens of glowing red markers stretched across Tennessee. Kentucky, Arkansas, Oklahoma. Every marker represented a truck that had been stopped. Every missing shipment had one thing in common: Officer Bryce Holloway. Melissa stared at the screen. "No," Victor continued. "At first we believed these thefts were the work of organized cargo criminals." Another slide appeared. "But eventually we discovered something far worse." Blue lines connected Bryce's patrol vehicle to warehouses owned by Vincent Crow's transportation companies. Then another name appeared: Deputy Logan Pierce. Logan's breathing became noticeably heavier. Victor didn't stop. Commercial trucks carrying expensive electronics, pharmaceuticals, aerospace components, and medical equipment were repeatedly stopped under fabricated probable cause. Ethan enlarged the timeline. Within 2 hours of each stop, cargo would disappear. Melissa looked directly at Bryce. "You told us those trailers had already been compromised before you found them." Bryce swallowed. Victor interrupted. "That was never true." He pressed a button. Surveillance footage appeared. It showed Bryce parked behind an abandoned warehouse just 30 minutes after one of his so-called inspections. A white delivery truck backed toward the trailer. Masked workers transferred cargo. Bryce stood nearby, watching, protecting. Melissa's shoulders sagged. "My God." Bryce shook his head violently. "That's not what it looks like." Victor answered immediately. "You're right. It's worse." The next video began. This time Logan Pierce appeared accepting an envelope from Vincent Crow's chief accountant. Another recording. Bryce laughing inside a restaurant while discussing inspection schedules. Another. Text messages, bank transfers, GPS records, encrypted radio logs, every piece fit together perfectly. Bryce suddenly pointed at Renee. "She manipulated all of this." Renee finally spoke. "No." She stepped forward. "You manipulated your own choices." Bryce looked desperate. "You were pretending to be a truck driver." "I was." "You lied." "I protected an investigation." "You trapped me." Renee's voice remained calm. "No, officer. You trapped yourself the moment you believed your badge placed you above the law." The room fell silent again. Victor walked toward the conference table. He placed a thick evidence binder in front of Melissa. This contains over 14,000 pages. Financial records, unrecovered communications, forensic reports, witness statements, video evidence, and sworn affidavits. Melissa slowly opened the binder. Every page carried federal evidence markings. There was no speculation, only proof. Olivia Bennett quietly lifted her camera again. She realized she wasn't simply documenting misconduct anymore. She was witnessing the collapse of one of the largest public corruption cases in the state's history. Outside, more federal vehicles filled the parking lot. Agents escorted several handcuffed men from unmarked sedans. Isaiah Turner watched through the glass doors. He recognized one of them immediately. Vincent Crow, the trucking magnate who had claimed for years that cargo theft was destroying honest businesses. Isaiah whispered, "It was him all along." Victor nodded toward another FBI supervisor. "Bring Mr. Crow inside." Moments later, Vincent entered the conference room in handcuffs. His expensive suit was soaked from the rain. His confidence disappeared the instant he saw Bryce. Bryce stared back. "You told me everything was covered." Vincent laughed bitterly. "I should have known you'd panic first." Bryce exploded. "You said nobody could touch us." Victor quietly placed another document on the table. "They can now." Sarah Collins stepped forward carrying several sealed federal envelopes. She addressed Bryce first. Officer Bryce Holloway. She opened the first envelope. You are hereby charged with conspiracy to commit interstate cargo theft. She opened another. Civil rights violations under color of law. Another. Evidence tampering. Another. Obstruction of justice. Another. Official misconduct. Another. Federal civil rights conspiracy. The list continued. Each charge struck harder than the last. Bryce looked toward Melissa. Chief, Melissa slowly removed the department badge from his uniform. The metal pin clicked softly as she held it in her hand. I trusted you. Her voice trembled. I defended you. She looked into his eyes. And you turned this badge into a weapon? She laid it on the conference table. You don't deserve to wear it anymore. Bryce lowered his head. 2 FBI agents stepped beside him. Victor spoke one final sentence. Officer Bryce Holloway. He nodded once. You are under arrest. The handcuffs clicked around Bryce's wrists. The same unmistakable sound echoed through the room. Renee heard it. It was identical to the sound Bryce had forced onto her wrist only hours earlier. Bryce looked at her as he was turned toward the exit. I'm sorry. It was barely above a whisper. Renee studied him for a long moment. Then she answered with quiet dignity. The apology isn't for me. Bryce frowned. She glanced toward Isaiah, toward Olivia, toward Chief Melissa Grant, and finally toward the long line of truck drivers gathering outside the station. It's for every innocent person who spent years believing no one would ever believe them. No one in the room could argue with that. As Bryce Holloway was escorted through the front doors in handcuffs, dozens of truck drivers silently stepped aside to let him pass. Not one of them cheered. Not one of them mocked him. Justice no longer needed humiliation. The truth had already done enough. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Nashville was filled long before the hearing began. Reporters lined the front steps. Camera crews occupied every available corner. The case had become national news, not simply because a police officer had been arrested, but because an entire corruption network hidden behind badges and freight inspections had finally collapsed. Inside courtroom 3, former Officer Bryce Holloway no longer wore a uniform. The confident smile that had once intimidated innocent drivers had disappeared. Instead, he sat beside his attorneys in a plain gray suit, avoiding eye contact with almost everyone in the courtroom. Across the aisle sat Vincent Crowe and Deputy Logan Pierce. Neither man spoke. Their empire had unraveled piece by piece after the FBI seized financial records warehouse surveillance, encrypted communications, and more than $40 million in illegal assets. Judge Eleanor Whitman entered the courtroom. Everyone rose. After reviewing weeks of testimony, thousands of pages of evidence, and countless hours of recorded video, she adjusted her glasses before delivering the ruling. The evidence presented before this court demonstrates a sustained pattern of corruption, abuse of authority, racial discrimination, and organized criminal conspiracy. Her voice echoed through the silent courtroom. Officer Bryce Holloway did not merely violate departmental policy. He betrayed the public trust. She looked directly at Bryce. You used the authority entrusted to you as a weapon against the very citizens you had sworn to protect. Bryce lowered his head. Judge Whitman continued. For conspiracy, civil rights violations under color of law, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and interstate cargo theft. She paused. This court sentences you to 22 years in federal prison. A quiet gasp swept across the courtroom. Bryce closed his eyes. For the first time since his arrest, he understood that there would be no escape. Vincent Crowe received 28 years. Logan Pierce accepted a plea agreement after cooperating with investigators and was sentenced to 12 years in federal custody. 17 additional individuals connected to the organization were convicted over the following months. More than 200 stolen shipments were recovered or traced. Millions of dollars in restitution were ordered for businesses and independent truck drivers whose livelihoods had been destroyed. Outside the courthouse, Chief Melissa Grant stepped to the podium. Behind her stood deputies from the reorganized sheriff's office. Every badge had been reissued. Every patrol policy had been rewritten. Independent oversight had been established. Mandatory body camera protections could no longer be manually disabled. Traffic stop reviews would now be audited by an outside civilian board. Melissa took a deep breath. Our department failed many innocent people. She didn't try to defend the past. We cannot erase that failure. But we can decide what kind of department we become from this day forward. She turned toward the crowd of truck drivers gathered across the street. I offer my sincere apology to every person whose dignity was ignored. Many accepted it quietly. Others simply nodded. Healing everyone knew would take time. A week later, Olivia Bennett's investigative documentary aired nationwide. It included body camera footage, court testimony, interviews with victims, and never-before-seen evidence released after the trial. The documentary became one of the highest-rated investigative broadcasts of the year. Thousands of viewers came forward with similar stories from across the country, leading to several additional federal investigations. Isaiah Turner watched the program from the same truck stop where he and Renee had shared breakfast months earlier. When the credits rolled, he smiled. One of the younger drivers sitting beside him shook his head. I almost quit trucking after what happened to me. Isaiah looked out the window toward the highway. I'm glad you didn't. So am I. Across the country, freight companies introduced new protections for drivers transporting federally monitored cargo. Civil rights organizations cited the case as an example of why accountability and independent oversight mattered. Several trucking associations created a scholarship in honor of drivers who demonstrated extraordinary professionalism under pressure. The first recipient's name was announced during the annual National Transportation Safety Conference. Special Agent Renee Jackson. She politely declined the public award. Instead, she requested that the scholarship fund be renamed after all professional truck drivers who had endured discrimination while simply doing their jobs. They deserve to be remembered, she said, not me. A month later, Renee quietly returned to work, not as a celebrated hero, not as a public speaker, and certainly not as someone seeking recognition. Before sunrise, she climbed into another tractor trailer at a secure federal logistics facility. A new undercover assignment waited. A young FBI agent approached her with a grin. Ready for another 18 months. Renee smiled as she adjusted her work gloves. If it helps protect people who'll never know my name. She closed the cab door. It's worth every mile. The engine rumbled to life. As the truck rolled through the security gate, Victor Hayes watched from a distance. Ethan Brooks stood beside him. You think she'll ever take a desk job? Victor laughed quietly. Not a chance. They watched the truck disappear onto the interstate. Another ordinary truck. Another ordinary driver. At least that's what the world would believe. But Victor knew better. Some heroes didn't wear capes. Some didn't wear uniforms. Sometimes they wore reflective safety vests, steel-toe boots, and drove 18-wheelers through the rain carrying not only cargo, but the weight of justice itself. The highway stretched endlessly toward the horizon as the morning sun finally broke through the clouds that had covered Interstate 40 only months before. The storm had ended. The truth remained.
True character is revealed not when life is easy, but when power is used against you. Never judge someone's worth by their appearance, profession, or the color of their skin. Justice may take time, but truth has a way of finding the light. Share your thoughts in the comments, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe if stories of courage and integrity inspire you.